When a government tries to manipulate international trade with tariffs, it's never a simple game of national pride or protection. It's a gamble, and the United States has just lost a round it, thought it couldn't lose. The attempt to impose new auto tariffs was sold as a patriotic defense of American manufacturing, a move to bring jobs home. But what actually unfolded was a chain reaction that exposed the fragility of an economy deeply entangled in global production networks. Automobiles today are not made in one country. They are assembled from parts produced across borders. Steel from one nation, electronics from another, labor from yet another. When tariffs are imposed, they don't simply punish foreign producers, they ricochet through the entire supply chain. The cost of parts rises, assembly slows down, and suddenly, American workers are laid off, not because foreign nations are stealing jobs, but because domestic policy has disrupted the very system that employed them. Tariffs destabilize global supply chains in ways that go far beyond the political slogans or patriotic rhetoric used to justify them. The modern global economy operates like a complex web connecting factories, workers, and markets across continents. Each part of that web depends on the smooth flow of materials, parts, and services. When a country imposes tariff, it inserts friction into that system, interrupting the free movement of goods that global industries rely upon. What looks like a policy aimed at punishing foreign competitors ends up disrupting domestic production, increasing costs, and undermining the very economic stability it claims to protect. To understand how deeply tariffs shake the system, one must look at how production works today. Decades ago, industries were more localized. A car might be built mostly within one country, with parts sourced nearby. But the push for cheaper labor and higher profits led corporations to spread production across borders. Today, a single automobile might include steel from the United States, wiring from Mexico, semiconductors from Taiwan, and assembly in Canada. Each link in that chain depends on the others being reliable and cost-efficient. When tariffs raise the price of any one component, the costs ripple through the entire system. The finished product becomes more expensive, and companies either raise prices for consumers or cut costs elsewhere, often through layoffs or wage reductions. Tariffs are often presented as a tool to protect domestic workers from foreign competition, but in reality, they tend to hurt the very people they are supposed to help. When materials and parts become more expensive, manufacturers slow production, postpone investment, or relocate operations. Jobs that were supposed to be protected end up vanishing because firms can no longer compete in a distorted marketplace. Even small producers who depend on imported machinery or raw materials find themselves squeezed. They cannot absorb the higher costs, yet they cannot pass them fully to consumers either. The result is a tightening of profit margins and a slowdown in industrial activity. This destabilization is not limited to one sector. Tariffs on steel, aluminum, or automotive parts affect construction, energy, and electronics as well. The global supply chain is like an ecosystem. Disturb one part, and the effects ripple throughout. A tariff imposed on imported steel raises the cost of building machinery, which in turn raises the price of agricultural equipment. Farmers then face higher operating costs, which can reduce their income and spending power, creating a chain reaction that reaches all the way to retail and services. The economy becomes less efficient, less predictable, and more vulnerable to shocks. Another consequence of tariffs is the creation of uncertainty, which is poison to global business planning. Corporations operate on long timelines. They invest in new facilities, contracts, and logistics networks based on stable trade conditions. When tariffs are imposed suddenly, or when threats of new tariffs appear in the news cycle, businesses hesitate to expand or hire. They hold back capital, delay decisions, and wait to see how political tensions unfold. This hesitation slows growth, not because of any immediate cost, but because of lost confidence in the stability of the system. Even when tariffs are later reduced or removed, the psychological damage to planning and trust can take years to repair. In addition to direct economic harm, tariffs often provoke retaliation from other nations. Each country affected by new trade barriers looks for ways to defend its own industries. This leads to a tit-for-tat escalation, as seen many times in history. When one country raises tariffs, others respond in kind, targeting politically sensitive sectors to apply pressure. Farmers, exporters, and small manufacturers in the initiating country suddenly find themselves locked out of markets they once depended on. The global supply chain, which once encouraged mutual benefit through cooperation, becomes a battlefield of economic nationalism. The disruption also reaches consumers who end up paying the hidden tax that tariffs represent. When imported goods cost more, domestic producers feel less pressure to keep prices low. The illusion of protecting local jobs comes at the expense of everyone else who must pay more for the same products. Inflation rises, purchasing power falls, and inequality widens. Wealthy investors may find ways to profit from volatility, but average workers bear the cost through higher living expenses and job insecurity. Moreover, tariffs expose the deep contradictions within global capitalism. Corporations that spent decades offshoring production to maximize profits suddenly face the consequences of their own decisions. They built their empires on cheap labor, complex logistics, and low trade barriers. When a government introduces tariffs in the name of economic sovereignty, those corporations push back, lobby for exemptions, or shift production once again to bypass the new restrictions. The supposed protection of domestic industries thus becomes another opportunity for large firms to manipulate policy to their advantage, while smaller companies are left behind. The destabilizing effect of tariffs also erodes alliances and partnerships that took decades to build. Nations that once cooperated on trade and development begin to view each other as adversaries. The trust required for long-term agreements fades, replaced by suspicion and short-term bargaining. Investors look elsewhere. Companies diversify supply chains into less efficient routes, and the overall productivity of the global economy declines. What was once a network built for mutual gain transforms into a patchwork of guarded interests and reactive policymaking. All these dynamics reveal that tariffs, far from strengthening national economies, often weaken them by attacking the very foundation of modern production. They introduce uncertainty where stability is needed, raise costs where efficiency is vital, and invite retaliation where cooperation once prevailed. In a globalized world, economic health depends not on isolation or protection, but on balance, coordination, and fairness within the systems that link nations together. Retaliation is inevitable whenever one nation uses economic force to impose its will upon another. In the realm of international trade, power is never exercised in isolation. Each country exists within a web of interdependence, relying on others for markets, resources, and technological inputs. When one government decides to disrupt that balance by placing tariffs, sanctions, or restrictions, it effectively invites a response. This is not merely a question of pride or politics, it is a structural necessity in a world economy built on reciprocity. No country can allow itself to appear weak or submissive in the face of economic aggression, for doing so would encourage further exploitation by others. Retaliation, therefore, becomes both a political statement and an economic survival mechanism. When tariffs are imposed under the pretext of protecting domestic industries, the targeted nation must respond not only to defend its economic interests, but also to maintain credibility with its own citizens and trading partners. Governments cannot sit idle while their exports are penalized or their workers lose jobs due to foreign policy maneuvers. Thus, retaliation often takes the form of counter tariffs aimed at industries that hold political significance in the aggressor country. These are carefully chosen to inflict maximum pressure where it will be most felt. Agriculture in rural states, manufacturing in industrial zones, or energy exports in strategic regions. Such measures are not random acts of defiance, but calculated moves within a larger political chessboard. Each side seeks to demonstrate resolve, to show that it will not yield under pressure. The logic of retaliation follows an old pattern of cause and effect. Once one nation raises barriers, another follows suit, and soon a chain reaction begins. What started as a targeted measure quickly expands into a full-scale trade war. Markets become uncertain, investments freeze, and global supply chains fracture. Consumers end up paying higher prices, while producers lose access to markets that once sustained them. Yet even as both sides suffer economic pain, neither is willing to back down. To retreat would be seen as weakness, and in a capitalist system driven by competition and image, weakness is intolerable. This cycle of action and reaction reflects the deeper instability of a global system where cooperation is secondary to profit and power. Retaliation is also inevitable because nations are political entities bound by domestic expectations. When a foreign power acts against a country's economic interests, public pressure mounts on leaders to respond decisively. Political survival often depends on appearing strong in the face of external threats. Even if retaliation leads to further harm, the immediate political cost of inaction can be greater. Leaders prefer to project strength rather than risk being seen as passive or compliant. Thus, economic retaliation becomes a form of political theater, each move designed not only for international effect, but also for domestic approval. The people already suffering from disrupted trade and higher prices are told that these sacrifices are necessary to defend national dignity or independence. The economic logic behind retaliation is intertwined with the dynamics of global capitalism. No major economy operates in isolation. All depend on flows of goods, capital, and labor. When those flows are blocked by tariffs or restrictions, other nations must find ways to restore balance or offset losses. One way is to strike back, targeting the aggressor's exports or investments. This tit-for-tat escalation often spills beyond economics into diplomatic relations and even military posturing. Retaliation becomes a tool not just of trade policy, but of geopolitical strategy. It can influence alliances, reshape supply routes, and alter the global hierarchy of power. In this sense, each act of retaliation is both an economic necessity and a symbolic assertion of sovereignty. The inevitability of retaliation also reveals the limits of unilateralism in a globalized world. No country, however powerful, can dictate terms indefinitely without provoking a backlash. The global economy functions like a network of mirrors. Any blow struck against one reflects back through others. A tariff against one nation's goods eventually raises costs for the country that imposed it, as supply chains adjust and alternative partners emerge. Meanwhile, the targeted nation often finds new markets, new alliances, and new strategies for survival. Retaliation thus reshapes global relationships, creating new patterns of cooperation among countries that share common grievances against protectionist policies. There is also a psychological dimension to retaliation. Nations, much like individuals, act not only from rational calculation but from emotion, pride, and memory. When a country feels insulted or exploited, it seeks redress not merely to recover losses but to restore self-respect. Trade conflicts therefore acquire a symbolic intensity far beyond their economic origins. The rhetoric of sovereignty, independence, and justice is invoked to justify retaliatory measures, transforming what could have been technical disputes into moral crusades. Once the conflict reaches this stage, compromise becomes harder to achieve. Each side frames its stance as a matter of principle, and retreat becomes politically impossible. Over time, this escalation corrodes trust between trading partners. Agreements once built on mutual benefit dissolve under suspicion and hostility. Businesses that relied on stable trade conditions find themselves trapped in uncertainty, forced to reconsider supply chains and investment plans. The global economy becomes fragmented into competing blocs, each seeking to protect its own markets through alliances and regional deals. What began as a simple tariff on a few products evolves into a systemic unraveling of global cooperation. Retaliation in this context is not an aberration, but the natural outcome of a system that prioritizes competition over collaboration. The cycle of retaliation also exposes the fragility of the current economic order. It shows that the appearance of global unity is maintained only as long as profits are shared and power remains balanced. Once that balance is disturbed, the underlying rivalries resurface. Each nation acts to defend its interests, even at the cost of collective stability. In such a system, retaliation is not just inevitable, it is built into the very DNA of how nations interact under capitalism. Every tariff, every sanction, every restriction is a reminder that cooperation without equality breeds resistance, and that economic force always generates its equal and opposite reaction. Workers bear the consequences every time economic decisions are made from the top down without regard for those who actually produce the goods and services that sustain the system. When governments impose tariffs, corporations relocate, or financial markets fluctuate, the people who feel the impact most directly are not the politicians or executives who design these policies, but the workers whose livelihoods depend on stable employment, fair wages, and predictable costs of living. The rhetoric surrounding economic policy is often framed in terms of national strength, competitiveness, or growth, but behind those abstractions lie human realities: factory closures, lost hours, higher prices, and eroded job security. When tariffs disrupt global supply chains, businesses are faced with rising production costs. To maintain profits, they rarely reduce executive bonuses or shareholder dividends. Instead, they cut costs where it hurts least for them and most for others. That means layoffs, reduced benefits, and wage stagnation for workers. Those who remain employed may be forced to do more for less, pressured to increase productivity to offset losses caused by trade disruptions. The corporate drive to preserve margins ensures that workers become the shock absorbers of every economic policy gone wrong. In theory, tariffs are supposed to protect jobs by discouraging imports and encouraging domestic production, but in practice, the opposite often happens. When imported materials or components become more expensive, domestic producers find themselves unable to compete internationally, and factories begin to downsize or close altogether. The same pattern repeats across sectors. A tariff on steel may help a handful of steel producers in the short term, but it raises costs for every industry that uses steel: automotive, construction, energy, and infrastructure. Those industries, in turn, are forced to raise prices or cut payrolls. Workers who had nothing to do with the policy's creation suddenly find themselves unemployed or facing reduced hours. Their families struggle to pay bills, their communities lose income, and local economies decline. The pain compounds as layoffs spread, small businesses close, and tax revenues shrink, leading to cuts in public services that working people depend on. What is presented as a strategy for national renewal often becomes a recipe for local devastation. Meanwhile, corporate leaders and investors who have the flexibility to shift operations or financial assets adjust quickly. They move production abroad, automate more aggressively, or speculate on the very volatility their policies create. Workers have no such escape routes. Their skills, homes, and families tie them to particular places and industries. When those industries collapse, retraining programs and promises of new opportunities rarely materialize in time. The result is not only economic insecurity, but psychological exhaustion, a growing sense that the system is rigged, that hard work and loyalty no longer guarantee stability or respect. The burden on workers is not confined to the industrial sphere. Even service and agricultural workers feel the ripple effects of trade conflicts. When tariffs provoke retaliation from other nations, exports like grain, meat, or dairy face new barriers. Farmers lose access to markets they relied on, and prices for their goods plummet. The government may offer temporary subsidies or relief packages, but these are stopgap measures, not solutions. Workers are told to wait it out while corporations and financial elites restructure and reposition themselves to profit from new conditions. The suffering is always pushed downward. In the broader sense, workers also bear the consequences of economic nationalism because it distracts from the deeper issues that affect their lives. Instead of confronting wage inequality, lack of worker rights, or the dominance of corporate power, governments redirect anger toward foreign nations or immigrant labor. This manipulation serves to divide workers rather than unite them. The message is clear: the enemy is not the employer cutting jobs or suppressing wages, but the foreign competitor supposedly threatening national prosperity. This narrative keeps workers fighting among themselves while the structure that exploits them remains untouched. The social consequences are equally severe. When jobs disappear and economic uncertainty grows, entire communities unravel. Schools lose funding, local businesses close, crime rates rise, and mental health declines. The stress of economic instability seeps into families, relationships, and daily life. In regions dependent on manufacturing or exports, a single policy decision made thousands of miles away can wipe out decades of social progress. Politicians may visit these areas during campaigns, promising renewal and revival, but once elected, they return to policies that prioritize corporate profit and trade posturing over human well-being. The workers remain where they always are, on the losing end of decisions made in boardrooms and government offices. Even in moments of apparent prosperity, the distribution of gains reveals the same imbalance. When tariffs are lifted, trade resumes, and growth returns, the recovery rarely benefits workers proportionally. Companies restore production but maintain the leaner, more exploitative labor practices adopted during the crisis. Temporary workers, contractors, and gig labor replace stable, full-time employment. Wages stagnate even as profits surge. The system learns to operate with fewer workers doing more work for less pay, while executives celebrate efficiency and productivity. Workers are praised for their resilience, but denied a share in the rewards. This recurring pattern exposes the deeper reality that economic policies are never neutral. Every decision about tariffs, taxes, or subsidies involves a choice about who will bear the costs and who will reap the benefits. In a system that prioritizes capital over labor, those costs inevitably fall on the shoulders of working people. They are the ones who endure the layoffs, absorb the inflation, and face the insecurity that others profit from. Their sacrifices are treated as necessary adjustments, their hardships as collateral damage in the pursuit of national greatness or corporate success. And when the consequences become too visible to ignore, they are offered slogans instead of solutions, promises instead of protection, and narratives of blame instead of justice. Nationalist economics is an illusion built on the comforting myth that a single country can isolate itself from the vast web of global interdependence and somehow emerge stronger, richer, and more self-sufficient. It promises the return of lost industries, the revival of domestic jobs, and the restoration of economic sovereignty. Yet in practice, it is little more than a performance, an emotional response to the insecurities and inequalities created by the very global capitalism it claims to resist. The modern economy is not a collection of separate national systems competing for dominance, but a tightly integrated network of production, finance, and labor. To pretend that this can be reversed through tariffs, trade wars, or nationalist rhetoric is to deny the material realities of how wealth is created and distributed in the 21st century. Every product consumed today is a testament to the interconnected nature of global production. The clothes people wear are stitched in factories spanning multiple countries. The devices they use are assembled from parts sourced across continents, and the food they eat depends on international supply chains that move goods through oceans and borders. The nationalist economic dream imagines that a country can pull back from this system, rebuild self-sufficiency, and prioritize its own workers without consequence. But the materials, technologies, and markets on which modern life depends cannot be contained within national boundaries. Even the most basic goods rely on inputs, resources, and knowledge that cross borders. The illusion of economic nationalism lies in believing that global capitalism can be managed with the tools of a bygone era, as if nations could simply raise walls and still thrive in a borderless economy. The call for nationalist economics often emerges in moments of crisis, when jobs are disappearing, wages are stagnant, and inequality is rising. Instead of addressing the structural forces behind these issues, leaders offer a simple story. The nation is losing because others are cheating, stealing, or exploiting its generosity. This narrative transforms complex economic dynamics into moral dramas of betrayal and victimhood. It turns the frustrations of ordinary people into political fuel, redirecting anger away from the corporations and elites who have profited from globalization and toward foreign competitors or immigrant labor. The illusion works precisely because it flatters the wounded pride of a population struggling to make sense of an economy that no longer rewards their effort or loyalty. But nationalism does not fix the problem, it masks it. It allows the same system of inequality to continue under a new flag. When nationalist leaders impose tariffs or restrictions in the name of protecting domestic industries, they often overlook how deeply those industries rely on foreign inputs. The car assembled in Michigan depends on parts from Mexico, electronics from Japan, and steel from Canada. The smartphone designed in California requires rare earth minerals mined in Africa and assembled by workers in China. Attempts to bring all of this production back home face enormous costs, both economic and environmental. Corporations, driven by profit rather than patriotism, will not return simply because politicians demand it. They will continue to seek the lowest labor costs, the highest efficiency, and the greatest market access wherever those conditions exist. Nationalist economics collides with the reality of corporate power, revealing that it is not nations but multinational capital that controls the flow of production and profit. Moreover, nationalist economics ignores how financial markets operate beyond borders. Capital moves instantly across the globe, chasing returns wherever regulations are weakest and labor cheapest. No government can stop this flow without isolating itself from investment and innovation. The same banks that fund domestic industries also finance competitors abroad, and the same corporations lobbying for protectionist policies rely on international credit and global consumers. The illusion of economic sovereignty crumbles under the weight of these contradictions. Nations that try to assert control over global markets quickly discover that their own corporations are among the most globalized actors on earth. The social costs of nationalist economics are equally destructive. When leaders promise to make the nation great again through economic isolation, they often create new divisions within their own population. Immigrants, minorities, and foreign workers become scapegoats for economic decline. Instead of confronting the real culprits, automation, corporate greed, and financial speculation, society turns inward, tearing itself apart with suspicion and resentment. The working class, already fragmented by decades of deindustrialization, becomes divided along cultural and national lines. This fragmentation weakens their collective power and ensures that economic discontent can be managed politically rather than resolved materially. Nationalism thus becomes the ideological shield that protects capitalism from its own failures. Even if nationalist policies achieve short-term gains, such as temporary increases in domestic production or political approval, they do so at long-term cost. Trade partners retaliate, global prices rise, and supply chains adapt by relocating elsewhere. The promised revival of domestic manufacturing rarely materializes, and when it does, it employs fewer workers due to automation and advanced technology. The illusion persists only because its failures can always be blamed on others, foreign governments, global conspiracies, or disloyal corporations. The narrative survives by constantly shifting the target of resentment, never by confronting the structural truth that national capitalism cannot exist in a globalized world. At its core, nationalist economics is not an economic strategy, but an emotional refuge. It offers certainty in an uncertain age, a sense of belonging in a fragmented world. It tells people that their struggles are not the result of systemic exploitation, but of external threats that can be defeated through willpower and unity. Yet no wall can contain capital, no tariff can restore equality, and no patriotic slogan can rebuild an economy organized around private profit rather than public good. The real challenge is not to retreat into illusions of national independence, but to rethink the entire structure of economic life. How production is organized, who controls it, and who benefits from it. Only then can the promises of stability, fairness, and dignity be more than empty words in the mouths of politicians who trade in dreams of a past that never truly existed. True reform requires systemic change because the problems facing modern economies are not isolated flaws or temporary missteps. They are built into the very design of the system itself. When inequality deepens, when wages stagnate while corporate profits soar, when debt becomes the only path to survival for millions of people. These are not accidents but predictable outcomes of an economic structure organized around private gain rather than collective well-being. Efforts to patch the system with new regulations, subsidies, or slogans fail because they leave the underlying logic of profit and competition untouched. Real reform must go beyond surface adjustments and confront the root who controls production, who makes economic decisions, and who benefits from the wealth created by society. For generations, economic policies have been shaped by the assumption that growth, if pursued relentlessly, would eventually lift all boats. Yet the evidence shows otherwise. Growth under the current system concentrates wealth in fewer hands, while the majority see their conditions stagnate or decline. Productivity rises, but wages do not. Technology advances, but insecurity grows. Political leaders respond with minor adjustments, raising or lowering taxes, adjusting interest rates, or offering limited welfare programs. But these measures only manage the symptoms of inequality, never its cause. Systemic reform means reimagining the purpose of an economy not as a machine for maximizing profit, but as a tool for meeting human needs. That requires changing the structure of ownership and decision-making that defines capitalism itself. The concentration of economic power in corporations and financial institutions allows a small elite to decide how resources are used, what gets produced, and whose labor is exploited in the process. Workers who create the value have almost no say in how their workplaces are run. This division between owners and workers is the foundation of exploitation. So long as this structure remains intact, no amount of policy tinkering will achieve real justice. True reform requires democratizing the workplace, giving workers direct control over the enterprises they sustain. When those who produce the wealth also make the decisions, priorities shift from maximizing short-term profit to sustaining communities, protecting the environment, and ensuring stability for all participants. Economic democracy is not an idealistic dream, but a practical necessity in an age when the old model is visibly collapsing under its contradictions. Systemic change also demands confronting the political structures that defend economic privilege. Governments that depend on corporate funding cannot truly challenge corporate power. Lobbyists write laws, and industries regulate themselves, ensuring that reform never cuts too deep. Politicians may promise fairness or accountability, but they operate within a framework built to preserve the dominance of capital. Breaking that cycle means redefining democracy itself, not as a periodic vote between pre-approved candidates, but as continuous participation in the decisions that shape collective life. True reform merges political and economic democracy, giving people control not just over who governs them, but over how their society's resources are distributed and used. The financial system offers another example of why surface reform is insufficient. Crises like the one in 2008 revealed how speculative behavior by banks and investors can devastate entire economies. In response, governments introduced regulations meant to prevent another collapse. Yet speculation continues, inequality has grown, and the next crisis always looms. The reason is simple: finance serves the logic of accumulation, not stability. As long as money itself is treated as a commodity to be traded for profit, rather than as a public utility for coordinating production and exchange, the system will reproduce the same cycles of boom and bust. A systemic solution would mean socializing finance, turning banks and credit institutions into democratically controlled tools for public investment rather than instruments of private enrichment. Environmental destruction further exposes the limits of superficial reform. Corporations that depend on endless consumption cannot be persuaded to prioritize sustainability through appeals to conscience or market incentives. Their survival depends on expansion, and expansion depends on extraction. Governments set emission targets and promote green technologies, but these measures coexist with continued fossil fuel production, deforestation, and pollution. Systemic change would mean reorganizing production itself, shifting from a model based on profit-driven growth to one based on ecological balance and long-term planning. That is not a matter of better regulation, it is a matter of changing the logic of the system from accumulation to preservation. The cultural and social dimensions of systemic change are equally vital. For decades, people have been conditioned to see themselves as consumers rather than citizens, as competitors rather than collaborators. Reform that does not challenge this ideology cannot succeed. Economic systems shape human behavior, teaching values of greed, individualism, and obedience to market forces. Systemic change must cultivate new values: cooperation, equality, shared responsibility, and democratic participation. Education, media, and community life must reflect these priorities, not the relentless pursuit of personal gain. When people see themselves as active participants in shaping their economic future, they develop the confidence and solidarity necessary to sustain reform. Resistance to systemic change is fierce, because those who benefit from the current arrangement possess enormous power. They control media narratives, influence legislation, and fund political campaigns. They warn that any challenge to their dominance will bring chaos or collapse. Yet history shows that real progress always begins with the courage to reject what seems inevitable. The abolition of slavery, the expansion of civil rights, and the creation of social welfare systems were all once dismissed as impossible or dangerous. Systemic change in the economy follows the same pattern. It begins with questioning the assumptions that hold the old order together and imagining alternatives that center human needs rather than private profit. The illusion of reform without transformation must be abandoned. Wage increases without changing ownership structures, subsidies without altering power relations, and regulations without democratization all leave the core of the problem untouched. True reform means replacing the economic architecture that breeds inequality with one built on cooperation and justice. It means rewriting the social contract to prioritize the well-being of workers, communities, and the planet over the enrichment of a few. The path towards such change is neither quick nor easy, but it is the only path that leads beyond the cycle of crisis, exploitation, and despair that defines the current system.